Thank you for joining the Disruptive Innovation Festival, the online festival of ideas that asks the question, what if we could redesign everything? Today, we are discussing what human histories tell us about the future. I'm Lou, and I'm delighted to welcome Selene van der Wielen onto the DIF platform. Selene is a design researcher and content strategist with degrees from both Warwick and Oxford universities. Today, she'll be telling us what recent insights regarding our past can tell us about the future. We'll be taking questions throughout, so do put your comments and questions to Selene in the comments space below the stream on the session page. You may need to complete a one-click process to access our chat window using Google, Facebook, or an email address. But let's get on with the session. Selene, I'll hand over to you.
Much. So as you just said, kind of welcome to a session on kind of what history can help us, help bring us to innovation. So I'm just going to set up a few slides and let me know if that works. No, wait. We were just mentioning potential technical difficulties. There we go.
Are you okay there, Selene?
What are you guys seeing?
I was seeing me, but now we have your slides. That's brilliant.
Okay, so there's been some great sessions over the past week for those of us who've been tuning into the DIF Festival on digital disruption, potential impact of automation, even artificial intelligence. And all this talk of the future is incredibly exciting for some of us and terrifying for others. So there's this feeling that we're living in unprecedented times, and I thought it'd be an interesting exercise to look back throughout history and see whether humanity has ever faced anything similar, and if there might even be a few lessons on how to go about dealing with our present and consequently designing our future. So I think we'd all agree that one of the greatest factors driving this feeling of change is technological innovation, changing how we create, consume, and communicate knowledge. Many of us have no doubt fond memories or not so fond memories of floppy disks and dial-up internet. And now we're all walking around with mini computers in our pockets and connected to the cloud and to each other. So whenever we speak about innovative technology, the first thing that comes up is Gutenberg's printing press. And so invented in 1440, it was inspired by Chinese block printing that had reached Europe a century before, and technology from local wine presses in the Rhine Valley. So that was a quick lesson on where you can find unusual inspiration. As Lewis Dartnell mentioned in his DIF session yesterday, the printing press is considered a gateway technology. So we very often attribute it to the fact that the Renaissance came about, it enabled the widespread democratization of information, standardization of language, a rise in literacy rates, and some even say it destabilized the church's monopoly on knowledge. But is that really the full picture? So a problem historians have with this narrative is that it doesn't account for oral traditions. So news would always travel along with people, and there were also official functions. So for example, town crieurs, people who would travel and announce the latest political events. The information was also shared as much during sermons as it was at the parish pub. So in regards to standardizing language, historians are also disagreeing on the effect of the printing press. Elizabeth Eisenstein writes that the printing press was an unacknowledged revolution. And so she's part of this school of thought saying this technology is what allowed a complete change in the direction of human history. But is the press itself the thing that enabled spelling and meaning of certain words to be fixed, or really is it dependent on society and humans agreeing to accept said spelling and meaning? Adrian Johns is one of those who's argued the latter, and he points out rightly that it takes decades, if not centuries, for certain linguistic elements to be agreed upon. And we have proof of this in print, where a lot of words have changed spelling throughout time, and even now, looking at an 18th or 19th century text, I won't necessarily recognize the spelling. There's also proofs in print of errors. So in the 17th century, the king's printer landed in some pretty hot water for printing a Bible with a version of the Ten Commandments that stated, "Thou shalt commit adultery." So the press is meant to be able to replicate the same texts in hundreds of iterations, but it also replicates hundreds of errors. So prior to the press, in order to own a book, one had to commission a manuscript, which was laboriously copied out by hand, most often by monks, and incredibly expensive. But printed books were also expensive, and they were able to be produced at a far higher rate, but their cost meant that it was actually something accumulated by wealthy families and the middle class. These weren't going out into rural areas. Manuscripts remained popular and were even preferred well into the 16th century. And they showed status. They were considered to be better quality because they were printed on vellum as opposed to paper. So the new technologies weren't actually necessarily appreciated at the time. Gutenberg made very little from his sale of the Bible. Printers were actually making most of their money printing ephemeral pamphlets and posters. So these could be indulgences for the church, so arguably the institution that made the most use of the printing press, or sales literature for street vendors promising, potions and recipes to improve your luck or performance in bed. And we can therefore see quite a few parallels with nowadays, with printing helping spread knowledge on one hand, but also really spreading false information. In regards to literacy rates, it really wasn't until the 19th and 20th century that we began to see widespread literacy in Europe. And that was mainly due to the implementation of basic education. So this graph that I'm sharing actually only starts in 1800, and the population in blue is the one that can read. The population in red, illiterate. And you can see to what extent we weren't there in 2014, we're still not there now, but it was really a process that's happened quite recently. There's also a discussion nowadays about to what extent can you be literate but not necessarily understand the sources that you're dealing with, whether it's questioning digital sources or questioning information. And interestingly enough, that was a point that was made when reading came about, was people thought, at least when it came to oral transmission of information, you knew who you trusted. You knew if you trusted another person. But it wasn't the case with print. On the point of the Catholic Church, yes, Protestantism came about and it challenged the stronghold. But there were also many different factions, so Lutheran, Anglican, Calvinist, and each of them sprung out of very particular political contexts. And they have very little to do with individuals being able to take up a Bible in German, as we've just seen, can't read at all. To this day, there are still millions of people who gather every Sunday to worship together and to pray for the Pope. So to what extent are things causing parts of change, but not really completely changing the status quo? There's the point of the scientific revolution and intellectuals being able to increasingly read each other and communicate their points. But there's actually an argument to be made that were actually corresponding mostly by letter. They were benefiting mainly from a reemergence of an efficient postal service under the Holy Roman Empire in the 15th and 16th centuries, rather than the advent of the press itself. And so we have a long-distance intellectual community in the 17th and 18th centuries that we now refer to as sort of republic of letters, but that knowledge wasn't trickling down to the wider population. Its effects, we have the movement of part of human history from the beginning. So it's prior to that republic of letters. It's prior to the press. And I'm not suggesting here that the printing press had no impact whatsoever, but just saying it's important to look at history and to challenge technological determinism. So we need to acknowledge the importance of very particular and complex social and political contexts, rather than assume that it's a new piece of technology that's going to change everything. I'm going to just do a quick side note on kind of audio technologies. So the history of the book has become a field in itself, mainly because of all these debates I've just mentioned. But we're increasingly looking at the sort of materiality of the book. And there was a fascinating piece that came out just this year by Abigail Williams called The Social Life of Books. And she explores domestic reading in the 18th century. And so to what extent do we have assumptions as to how the act of reading is done? So reading wasn't particularly some sort of solitary activity that people did locked away in libraries. You had families and visitors who would sit around in this sort of a situation, so doing daily chores, listening to the literate or one or two of the literate family members read something out, obviously by quite poor lighting for the day and age. So it would usually be someone young who still had quite good eyesight. And it was fashionable to perform and really exaggerate your reading so as to engage your listeners. So you obviously couldn't read out in one sitting. And it wasn't always possible to assemble the same group for every new chapter. So people were used to following stories actually by catching glimpses here and there. So our current sort of obsessions with podcasts and sort of rise of audio and digital assistants isn't so much something that should surprise us, but it's really a continuation of a long tradition of listening and interacting with our information in an audio way. And the kind of third main part of information is how do we take in, oh, sorry, that was meant to be the podcast point. How do we take in information visually? And so I was really excited this weekend. I was able to try out a virtual reality headset. And there's a lot of really interesting applications, notably that you can, enter these really immersive experiences and walk in someone else's shoes. It's an incredible way to explore new worlds and to build empathy for others. There's been some incredibly thought-provoking and award-winning VR documentaries, so on the Syrian refugee crisis or desertification in Africa, amongst others. And we're seeing VR headsets kind of pop up at climate change conferences or Davos to help lobby for change in policy. And one of the things that it shows, it can really show the horror of a specific situation. There's quite a few parallels, actually, between VR and earlier technologies. And for this point, I want to thank Gabo Aurora, who made these parallels quite obvious. And so Aurora, as some of you might already know, is one of the creators of Clouds Over Sidra. It's a 2015 VR documentary of a young Syrian girl's life in a refugee camp. And he's pointed out that in the United States, the Vietnam War was amongst the first to be televised. And at the time, it was thought that the horror and reality of seeing war in our living rooms would put an end to American intervention abroad. And with the exception of 5 years, the US has actually continuously been in conflict across the globe. So it didn't have that desired or predicted effect. And we have photography. Similarly, sorry, I'm realizing that I'm just completely skipping over my slides, but these are your 1970s television set. And in regards to photography, we as being one of the first photographed conflicts in the US, and it was meant to kind of change the perception of conflict from something that was painted and romanticized to something that was seen as actually quite brutal. And so we have pictures of mangled bodies and just people lying in fields. And it did really help gain momentum for sort of anti-conflict movement, but it didn't really. And so new visual technologies bring new information and perspectives, but our tendency as humans to consume so much of them usually leaves the novelty wearing off quite quickly. So it's actually quite difficult to know to what extent VR will have a long-term effect or will have a long-term use. And I kind of want to take the step back and say, so when we think of these technologies of communication as, one replacing another, we actually should see over time that they complement each other. And so I'm just going to stop sharing that slide before we get to the. There we go. So most importantly, different societies record and use information differently. And so I'm hoping that that's kind of what's come across. So we're creating a hierarchy of technologies of communication that lead to the exclusion of certain populations. So something that might already become apparent to some of you as I've been going through different examples is that these are all modern European examples. And as I mentioned earlier, we've always lived in a global network where actually information and human movement has been a norm, and been able to cross boundaries. In the ancient world, so when we're looking at European history, Greek civilizations, which continue to inspire us to this day, prioritized oral communication in public forums and theaters and performances. Incidentally, they're also the ones that introduced a linear time model to Europe with a distinct past, present, and future. Before it was much more cyclical, which goes back to sort of how history can be quite an interesting way of looking at time. But anyways, in present-day Australia, Aboriginal cultures are amongst the oldest known to man, and much of their lore is passed through word of mouth. But we don't value it to the same extent. And so why aren't we valuing oral histories as much as we're valuing histories that have been written down and in most cases kind of imposed from a Western perspective and a Western colonization? So the controls of the means of producing knowledge are increasingly important. There's a digital space now that gives us access to more data than we know what to do with. So we're constantly looking to new information for answers rather than looking at the information we already have or the information of things that have happened. Algorithms are pushing certain stories to the front of our newsfeed. None of this is really being done independent of human intervention, though. And so to what extent are we turning towards new technologies to address the same problems over and over and finding that actually they're not the ones delivering the solution? It's more about having to change a human problem and a human change in culture. So some of these moments happen over hundreds and thousands of years, and yes, the pace of change is happening far quicker, but we're realizing history is just going to be constant change, and the future that we're going to have ahead of us is going to be constant change. And some of these changes are going to be more apparent than others, but if we continue to attribute power to technologies rather than, it's not going to be possible to really map out the systems and leverage the right elements and the human elements. And I do think we have reasons to be excited by new technologies. We simply have to focus on understanding how to use them in a positive way. And they can really allow us to create a more social, sustainable, and inclusive future if we take all these new perspectives on board. And I'm hoping that some of the things that I've covered are new, or if not, that maybe you've had a slight shift in perspective for some things. But ultimately, we often think we know our own past, and yet we're constantly discovering new things about it. And similarly, for many, the future seems like a certain thing, and it can be a positive future or something that seems quite oppressive. But how we choose to portray it really is going to affect our actions in the now. So human-centered design is an integral part of this Disruptive Innovation Festival. And I just kind of wanted to end by joining my voice to a growing group of people who've pointed out that it's not really just about creating human-centered futures, but rather humanity-centered futures, really taking into account the full experience that we've had. So that's been me bumbling along. Thank you for that. Sorry that it's been a bit of a technological mess. There we go. But yeah. Sorry, I can't hear you. Oh,
Celine, can you hear me?
Yes.
That wasn't a bumbling mess at all. It was brilliant. I'm just sitting here wondering what other misprints have sent us on the wrong trajectory and we've never recovered. But we've got some brilliant questions. Are you up for?
Yeah.
Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We hear this all the time, but what examples are there of this actually happening?
So one of the things that I ended up cutting from this talk, so I really focused on technologies of information communication, but actually my background's in migration history.
Yeah.
And We continuously talk about refugee crises. So this is something that I've seen actually at quite a few events in the past month. And it's used in a very strategic way to say this is a catastrophe and we can't deal with it. And we are going to kind of put all these people into camps until we stop thinking about them. And we're seeing integration failures on a government level, but also on a societal level over and over. Actually, migration has happened since the beginning of humanity. We've moved across the globe, and sometimes it's been for good things, looking for employment opportunity or rejoining other family members, but more often than not, it's been forced migration because of conflict, because of famine or epidemics.
Yeah.
And it's the one thing that until we actually address this as a sort of constant part of the human experience, rather than this thing that's going to happen every few years, and so we don't really need to create sustainable solutions, it's going to keep happening. And at the moment, that's what we're seeing.
Do you have, this is another question in from someone watching, do you have favourite examples we've used historical knowledge and insight and stopped the past from repeating itself?
Ooh, that's a really good one.
Where we have used historical insight, sorry.
Well, I think what's really interesting in that question is kind of the usage of history. And so what I'm saying is we're very often, or what I've said in the session is we use the printing press history in a very particular way. And so we have a lot of examples of politicians, for example, being able to use examples of the past either in really negative ways or to kind of stir up fear, or positive ways of bringing people together because they've survived greater hardship. So I'm thinking American presidents are quite capable of using this. Not our current one, but
to mind.
yeah. And whenever I do hear those speeches, I always kind of have to question, oh, why are you choosing to use that perspective? So we have British politicians who sometimes talk about Britain's greatness in regards to its imperial past, and yet some people might hear that speech and think, but that's not a positive.
Yeah.
Why are we embracing that? I don't know if that's really answered that person's question, but
I think it was great. Was there resistance to the printing press, and how was it handled? And can that teach us something about the opposition to current technologies?
So there was some resistance, but I think it wasn't something that came about and people thought, oh, this is really going to change everything. And I think that's what's interesting with our kind of current obsession of picking a new technology every so often and thinking this is going to really change the game. Because, as I said, if you were wealthy and you really wanted to show your knowledge and your status, a printed book was actually not considered to be something you would want to share, but also it wasn't considered to be as durable. So having something that's printed on leather was a much better investment than having something printed on paper. And so I think it was more of a printing presses were quickly kind of spread out across Europe, but people didn't necessarily see it as something that had to be shut down.
Okay. Dot, who is on the diff site, has asked, she would, be interested to hear how different societies have different priorities when they use mobile phones.
How different? Oh, wait, I'm seeing that question.
To make it really clear for viewers, it now says, which current technologies are most similar to the development of the printing press? But Dot did want to know if different societies have different priorities, I guess, for using mobile phones. Like for us, it's very social, isn't it? It's just, most people I've seen in cafes and things, you have a crowd of people and they'll just be using a phone. For others, is it emergency use only, or is it a matter of sustaining life, and business?
Well, I think there's a really interesting point about how we kind of hop from one technology to the next, and we think, mobile phones recently someone kind of showed me one of those really old mobile phones, and now
Yeah,
they're
the
like the small things in computers, and we almost don't even
around when they came in.
Yeah, like they're quite impressive and hefty. But we now have kind of moved on to smartphones, and we've left computers aside. Other societies have jumped in a very different path. So I was working in Kenya this summer, and people use mobile money as a way of accessing certain certain structures, be it financial structures, or being able to create payments. It's a very different way of interacting with that technology than me using it to check Facebook.
Yeah.
And as a result, the way that things are built for it is also very different than if you were to build something for a website and then assume that it would be exactly the same on a smartphone, because actually a lot of people don't have smartphones. A lot of people are still on Nokia phones that are durable, that you can charge once, because that's the only time that you're going to have access to power during your week. So I think the thing I'm trying to get across is, to what extent is it really not a linear path? We're really iterative in how we use different technologies, and we should never assume that the way that we use it is the same way that other people use it.
Yeah. Celine, history, technology, and design is a very unlikely mix. Are you unique in your field?
I don't think so. I think it depends on how on what labels you choose to explore. And I think as someone who went from a history background is going towards more and more the design research part of it.
Yeah.
I had a lot of vocabulary to learn, and that was something I was really worried about for this talk today, was that I would end up using too much history vocabulary that maybe would be a bit jargony for others. But I think design research, at least, is really going out and speaking to people and understanding where they come from and what are their needs. And ultimately, that's kind of what historians do, is to what extent do we assume that we know what's happened in the past, and we assume that people's needs were very specific. This is a bit of a tangent, but a lot of people use Maslow's hierarchy of needs as an example of how we should build things to address human needs. Maslow's hierarchy of needs hasn't really been proven in any scientific way. It's actually a very specific context for white middle class European people, and so it's not applicable to be applied and for design elsewhere. But
can I jump back to a question that I read wrongly in conjunction with another question that totally didn't make sense? This is from someone on the DIF site, John. To make it really clear for viewers, which current technologies are most similar to the development of the printing press?
I feel like this is such a big question. I think in the way they all are. So when I say, so the things I've covered, whether it's virtual reality, there's now augmented reality and other things, they're all going to contribute to perspective to things, and we're going to maybe be able to share things in a new way, but I don't think they're going to completely change the game. And the point of the discussion of the printing press is, to what extent is the printing press an element in a far greater complex system? These technologies are really exciting elements in a complex system, and we just need to learn how to really harness them for human needs.
Okay, can I just ask one more question?
Yeah.
How did you end up looking at history and technology in this way?
I have a very great professor to thank for that, Roberta Bivens from Warwick, if she ever sees this, did a history of medicine module, which was fascinating. And we looked at kind of to what extent we assume medicine is something that's very scientific and has always in a specific way. If you look back history of technologies and innovations, be they medical or for information communication technology, really have a lot to say about how we learn things and how we define ourselves as humans. So something that I didn't touch upon on the talk today, and I don't know to what extent it's maybe been touched upon for DIF, is transhumanism. This idea that in the future, we might start adding things to our bodies to make them more performative. But actually, we have a parallel past of people looking at, oh, I'm going to miss the word. If you had lost a limb, you would wear it's going to be really loud.
Oh, prosthetic.
There we go, prosthetics.
Yeah.
And some people at the time chose to take it as something that was a way of being able to reclaim a previous life. And other people chose to politically not wear them because they wanted to use wounds as a sort of political statement against war. But also, we didn't ever really study human movement until they had to realize how to create prosthetics in order to recreate a natural human gait. And so it's really looking at those moments in history where you realize we had never thought to question our perspective on something until we wanted to create something new. And so now we're creating this new future, but we have to really kind of question what we know in order to do that, is what made me really interested in the field.
Wow. Celine, if people want to find out more, where do they go? Do you have a website?
I have a blog on migration if people have a very specific interest, which is called themigrantmake.com. But also I would really welcome any emails or tweet me at Selene VDW. That's my Twitter handle. And it's really a conversation that I'm hoping a lot of people will start having more and more. So I'd love to hear people's thoughts, both constructive feedback. So if that's negative feedback, please do let me know. But that would be really great.
Thank you so much. Well, I hope you guys at home or online found this event as fascinating as I did. Celine, I'd really like to thank you so much for taking the time out to tell us all about human histories. Remember, if you're watching this session via DIF On Demand, we still want your comments, questions and feedback. So please utilise that comment space beneath the video stream. Of course, there's lots more coming up at the DIF. Tomorrow in the live studio at 5 p.m. GMT, it is Circular Economy Under the Radar with Phil Brown, Melissa Potrain and Thomas Leach. On Friday at 2, we have an open session, much like this one, which is going to discuss how to solve Africa's waste challenges with the latest technology. Thanks once again to Celine, and remember to catch up on everything we have going on at thinkdiff.co. That's all from me.